The tornado came without mercy. The sky tore itself open above Cedar Grove, Oklahoma, as if some giant hand had ripped the heavens in half. Winds screamed like freight trains barreling through the night. Roofs lifted, trees bent until they cracked, and whole lives were shredded into flying debris. And in that chaos, while most people ran for cover, one man ran toward the storm. His name was David Miller, a single father with little more than calloused hands, a stubborn heart, and a promise to his daughter that he would never walk away when someone needed him. He had no money to spare, no mansion to hide in, but what he did have was courage. And on that night, it would matter more than anything. Because somewhere in the screaming winds, a faint cry for help pierced through the roar, a voice half broken, half drowned by thunder. He couldn't see the person yet, but David didn't hesitate. He dove headfirst into the collapsing community center splinters and glass raining down, not knowing that the stranger he was about to save would change his life forever. What he couldn't possibly imagine was that behind the torn coat and bloodied face was Isabella Reyes, the reclusive billionaire whose fortune stretched from Silicon Valley to Tokyo. The woman the world whispered about but rarely saw. And tonight, fate had dropped her into his arms. Follow my story to the end and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. David's boots slammed against the soaked pavement as he sprinted. The sirens howled above him, shrill and insistent, demanding that everyone get underground. But his mind wasn't on himself. It was on the sound, that desperate cry. "Hold on!" he shouted into the storm, though he knew the person couldn't hear him. His voice was snatched by the wind, shredded before it could travel more than a few feet. He pushed harder, lungs burning until he reached the crumbling facade of the old community center. Its walls groaned like an animal in pain. Windows exploded outward, shards scattering across the parking lot. He ducked instinctively, covering his head with his arm, and then forced himself through the double doors that banged wildly on broken hinges. Inside was a nightmare. The air was thick with dust insulation, the acrid scent of burning wires. Emergency lights flickered weakly, painting everything in sickly yellow glows. Pieces of ceiling tiles rained down. Somewhere a baby cried. Somewhere else, a man coughed violently. But David's ears locked onto that other voice, the one that had cut straight through the storm. He followed it. Past a fallen beam, past a shattered vending machine spilling candy bars like broken teeth, past a line of terrified families rushing for the basement stairs. "Sir, don't!" Someone grabbed at his sleeve, a woman holding two children close. "It's coming down." "You'll get killed in there," David shook his head, pulling free. "If somebody's still in here, I'm not leaving them," he said. His voice was rough but steady, and then he saw her. She was stumbling near the entrance hall, trying to fight her way in, even as others fled. Her dark coat was ripped down one sleeve, her face streaked with blood from a cut along her temple. Her hair whipped around her like tangled silk, and her eyes, sharp even through fear, locked on him. The ceiling above her cracked with a sickening groan. "Move!" David bellowed and lunged. He tackled her just as the support beam gave way. Wood and plaster crashed where she had been standing, shattering the tiled floor. He rolled with her behind a concrete pillar, shielding her body with his own. Debris pelted his back. Something sharp sliced through his shirt, cutting into skin. He clenched his teeth, refusing to cry out. The woman gasped against him, trembling. You saved—" "Not done yet." He interrupted, his voice a growl against the storm's fury. He lifted his head, eyes scanning. The basement. They needed to get to the basement. The whole building groaned like it was ready to collapse, but the concrete support walls might hold. He pulled her to her feet, gripping her wrist firmly. "This way," he ordered. She didn't argue. Her heels slipped on the wet floor as he guided her, half dragging, half supporting through the chaos. Around them, terrified townsfolk poured toward the stairwell. Children screamed. Someone shouted prayers. A piece of roofing sheet metal whipped past, narrowly missing them both. She stumbled again, her knees buckling, but David caught her under the arms, steadying her. "Stay with me," he said softer this time. His voice carried a steadiness she clung to. Her eyes flicked up at him. For just a second, through all the fear, he looked less like a stranger and more like an anchor. They pushed forward. The basement door loomed ahead, a heavy steel frame, battered but still intact. David shoved it open with his shoulder, urging her inside first. They stumbled down into the dimly lit shelter where dozens of neighbors huddled together. Dust coated their faces, their eyes wide with fear. Mothers clutched their children. Old men leaned against walls, whispering prayers. The moment David stepped in, the storm above roared louder, as if furious at losing two more lives. The whole basement vibrated with the violence outside. The woman he had pulled from the wreckage leaned against the wall, catching her breath, blood matting her hair. David looked at her closely now. Expensive coat, designer shoes scuffed but still unmistakable, a face he thought he'd seen somewhere before on a magazine cover, maybe in the news. She caught him staring. Her lips parted as if to speak, but the ceiling shook again. Concrete dust rained down. The children shrieked, and without thinking, David reached for her hand. She gripped it, tight, like someone drowning clinging to a rope. And in that dark, trembling basement surrounded by the storm's wrath, neither of them realized how that single touch would alter the rest of their lives. The morning light filtered through what was left of the clouds, casting a pale, bruised glow across Cedar Grove. The tornado had passed, but the town still trembled in its wake. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Neighbors stumbled from shelters, dazed, clutching one another. In the Miller household, what remained of it, the smell of burnt coffee lingered faintly in the air. The roof was half-gone shingles scattered like broken feathers across the yard, but somehow the kitchen still stood. And in that kitchen, with his sleeves rolled up and his jaw set tight, David Miller was flipping pancakes. He stood at the stove, shoulders tense, spatula in hand. The cast-iron pan hissed softly, one of the few sounds that felt normal. The edges of the pancake darkened faster than he meant them to. His hand trembled slightly, and he gripped the handle tighter, steadying himself. At the table, a handmade card leaned against the sugar bowl. Its crooked rainbow letters read, "World's Best Dad." The marker had bled a little on the paper, but the colors still shone. It had been a gift from his daughter 2 years ago, and he refused to move it. Every morning that card stood guard like a small, stubborn flag of hope. "Dad," a voice broke through the silence. He turned. Emily, 13 years old, sat cross-legged on a chair, tying her shoelaces with deliberate focus. Her sneakers were scuffed, the laces uneven, but her eyes, her mother's eyes, were sharp. Too sharp for a girl her age. "You're burning it again." David glanced down. Sure enough, the pancake's edge had gone black. He flipped it quickly, wincing at himself. "Just adding a little character, kiddo," he said with a half-smile, sliding it onto a chipped plate. "Gives it some crunch." Emily rolled her eyes, but couldn't quite hide the curve of a smile tugging at her lips. She reached for the syrup, then hesitated. "Dad, did you sign my field trip permission slip?" David froze for half a second. The bills stacked on the counter caught his eye, electric gas mortgage. Each envelope like a stone pressing down on him. The field trip cost $35. $35. Not a fortune. But in their house lately, $35 might as well have been a mountain. He forced a smile. "Already signed. It's in my wallet." It wasn't. Not yet. But he'd figure it out. He always figured it out. Emily studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She wasn't fooled, not completely, but she didn't push. The radio on the windowsill crackled to life with the morning forecast. Static, then the clipped voice of a meteorologist, unseasonably warm air, potential for severe weather development. David's grip tightened around his coffee mug. Spring in Oklahoma always carried that edge, a restlessness in the air like the earth itself holding its breath. "You think we'll get a big one this year?" Emily asked, her fork poised midair. David's chest ached. Her question was casual, but he knew what she meant. Tornado Alley kids were raised on the language of storms. They didn't fear them the way outsiders did. They respected them, lived with them, expected them. "Mother Nature keeps her own counsel," he said, echoing words his father used to say. "But we're ready if she decides to visit." Emily gave a little nod. Their storm cellar was stocked always. He might let bills pile up, let the roof leak, let his boots wear thin, but that cellar, that was sacred. After breakfast, Emily slung her backpack over her shoulders. The straps were patched with duct tape. David's handiwork. She paused at the door. "We're okay, right?" "Dad?" David crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. He buried his face in her hair, which smelled faintly of strawberry shampoo. We're better than okay, he whispered. We've got each other. That's all we need. For a moment she relaxed against him and he felt her small shoulders soften. 13 years of trust still light enough to rest in his arms. The rumble of the school bus broke the moment. Emily hugged him once more before darting outside. David stood at the doorway watching until she climbed aboard. She waved through the smudged glass and he raised his hand in return. When she was gone, he turned back to the counter. The bills waited. He picked one up, flipped it over, then dropped it face down again. He couldn't bring himself to open them yet. He pulled on his steel-toed boots. The leather was cracked, the toes scuffed from years of hard work. He tugged them tight, stood, and grabbed his hard hat. Another day. Another fight to stay ahead. Outside, the spring air carried that unsettled quality again. The leaves shivered on their branches, though no breeze blew. He paused, scanning the horizon, then shook it off and climbed into his truck. The engine coughed before catching. He patted the dashboard. Come on, old girl, just one more week. As he drove, his thoughts lingered on the woman from the storm. The stranger he'd pulled into the basement, her grip on his hand fierce and trembling. The way her eyes had looked right into his, not with money or power or judgment, but raw fear. He didn't even know her name. He shifted gears, focusing on the road ahead. Work waited. Responsibilities waited. He didn't have the luxury of wondering about strangers. But the memory lingered anyway. Miles away inside a glass fortress of a mansion, Isabella Reyes stood at her floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out over the plains. The storm had clawed at her estate, but left it standing. Her eyes weren't on the damage, though. They were on the town in the distance. Cedar Grove. She thought of the man who had thrown himself into danger for her. The man who had shielded her with his body, who had pulled her through chaos with hands roughened by years of labor. Her life had always been calculated, controlled, but last night, for the first time in decades, she had been helpless. And in that helplessness, she had found something she couldn't name. Richards. Her house manager stepped quietly into the room. Your 7 a.m. call with Tokyo is ready. She didn't move. She just kept staring at Cedar Grove, at the small town where people had risked everything for each other, while she had hidden behind walls of steel and glass. Thank you, Richards, she said finally, her voice quieter than usual. But cancel my afternoon meetings. Cancel them. Richards blinked. The Berlin investors. They can wait. She turned from the window, her eyes shadowed but sharp. There's something I need to see for myself. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, even though the sky had already begun to clear. The mansion was silent except for the faint hum of electronics and the muffled ticking of an antique clock on the far wall. For all its grandeur, Isabella Reyes's estate felt more like a vault than a home. Gleaming marble floors stretched beneath her heels as she crossed to her study, each step echoing in the vastness. Stacks of papers lay neatly arranged on her desk. A copy of Tech Innovator magazine sat on top her own face, staring back at her from the glossy cover. Isabella Reyes, the invisible empress of Silicon Valley. The photograph showed her in profile-tailored suit, poised expression, every hair in place. A woman in command, a woman untouchable. She hated it. The article praised her genius, her revolutionary breakthroughs in quantum computing, her ruthless efficiency. But the words failed to capture the emptiness of nights spent in hollow corridors, the sterile silence of dinners at a table built for 20 but set for 1. Her father's voice came back to her deep and stern, echoing through the years. Success is a fortress, little dragon. Build it high enough, and nothing can ever hurt you. She had built it, wall after wall, fortune after fortune. And yet last night in the storm's fury, when the roof cracked open and death pressed down from every angle, her fortress had been meaningless. She hadn't been the billionaire then. She hadn't been the empress. She'd just been a woman, frightened and bleeding, clinging to the hand of a man who didn't even know her name. She closed her eyes, remembering the strength of his grip. Solid, grounding, alive. Her intercom buzzed. Miss Reyes Richards' voice composed as always. The property acquisition in Cedar Grove, our latest offer, was refused. The owners cite family history and community ties. They won't sell, not even at double market value. Isabella's lips pressed into a thin line. Increase the offer, she said automatically, her tone clipped, rehearsed. Of course. A pause, then more carefully. Unless you'd prefer to meet with them personally. Her eyes flicked toward the window again, toward the distant town still scarred by the tornado. She thought of the families she had seen huddled in the basement, faces etched with dust and fear yet bound together in solidarity. She thought of that man David taking command, directing neighbors, shielding strangers. No, she said after a beat. Personal involvement complicates business decisions. Increase the offer. Yes, Miss Reyes? The intercom clicked off. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the unopened local newspaper on the corner of her desk. She rarely glanced at such things. Yet the headline caught her eye: Cedar Grove Community Center faces closure. Below it, a faded photo of children playing basketball in a peeling gymnasium. Their sneakers squeaked on warped floors. Their laughter rose despite the broken scoreboard hanging by a wire. Isabella reached for the paper. Her fingertips lingered on the image longer than she intended. For a fleeting moment, her chest tightened, a whisper of something unfamiliar. Regret longing. Richard, she called softly into the intercom again. Yes, Miss Reyes. Get me everything on that community center. Budgets, attendance, structural reports. He hesitated. Will this affect the acquisition strategy? Her fingers traced the children's faces on the newsprint. No, she said. But perhaps we'll explore alternatives. Integration, not demolition. As you wish. She ended the call, standing abruptly. The walls seemed closer now, suffocating. Her father's fortress felt less like protection and more like a cage. She stepped to the window once more. Clouds still gathered on the horizon. Storm season wasn't over yet. A memory returned unbidden, the roar of the tornado, the sting of blood in her eyes, the sensation of David's body shielding hers from falling debris. Her heart gave a strange jolt. For the first time in years, Isabella Reyes canceled her afternoon meetings. She grabbed her keys, ignoring Richard's raised eyebrows. She would drive herself, something she hadn't done in a decade. The Porsche growled to life beneath her hands, the leather wheel cool and strange against her palms. The fortress could wait. She needed to breathe air that wasn't filtered through glass and marble. She needed to see Cedar Grove not as a property, not as a line on a balance sheet, but as a place where people lived and bled and rebuilt. Meanwhile, across town, David Miller's lunch break found him in the cab of his dented pickup. The construction site hummed in the background. Nail guns, hammers, voices shouting instructions. But his focus wasn't on the job. On his lap lay an old leather photo album. The cover was cracked, the binding worn, but inside was his family's history. He flipped to a page. There was Sarah, his late wife, smiling down at baby Emily fresh from the delivery room. Light from the hospital window bathed them both in gold. His throat tightened. He could almost hear Sarah's laugh, that lilting sound that had once filled their little house with warmth. He could almost feel the weight of Emily as a newborn, tiny and fragile, in his arms. The next page showed storms past. Tornado damage from 1985. Black and white photos of their family home rebuilt after the Great Storm of '62. His father had glued each one in carefully, his handwriting looping beneath them. We endure. We rebuild. David closed the album, gently tucking it into the glove box. He ran a hand over the worn dashboard, grounding himself in the present. Mark no. David, a voice called. He looked up to see his coworker Tom, face pale, pointing toward the radio on the workbench. The broadcast crackled with urgency. Severe thunderstorm watch issued for multiple counties. Strong supercell development expected by late afternoon. Residents advised to prepare storm shelters. David's stomach dropped. He straightened. All right, everyone, he called, raising his voice over the clamor. Button everything down. Nobody leaves until every loose board is secured. Move. The crew jumped to action. They'd done this before. Tornado Alley men learned to move fast when the sky began to shift. His phone buzzed. A text. Dad, they're keeping us late at school because of the weather. Ms. Rodriguez says it's safer here than on the buses. David exhaled, tension easing slightly. Smart lady, he typed back. Stay put, sweetheart. I'll come get you when it's clear. He added a heart emoji. Emily had insisted he learn them. As he hit send, the wind picked up across the field. Dust swirled. The sky, bright just an hour ago, darkened into a sickly green. David's jaw clenched. Storm season had arrived. Far away on her private observatory screens, Isabella studied live radar patterns flashing in red and orange. The storm was growing faster than expected. She pressed a button. "Full emergency protocols now," Miss Reyes Richards cautioned. "The estate can withstand a Category 5. There's no need." "Do it," she said sharply, then softer. "And get me Cedar Grove's emergency service contacts. If the center collapses, they'll need help." Her reflection stared back at her in the glass. For the first time in her life, the walls she had built didn't feel high enough. The afternoon air carried a heaviness that pressed against every roof, every window pane, every chest in Cedar Grove. Clouds stacked high and dark in the west, rolling in with a menacing weight. The town had seen storms before, dozens, maybe hundreds, but everyone who lived here knew when the sky meant business. And today the sky meant business. On the construction site, David Miller wiped sweat from his brow and scanned the horizon. The light had shifted again, the sun swallowed by thick green-gray clouds. The smell of ozone sharpened metallic and bitter. He'd grown up in Tornado Alley. He knew those signs the way sailors know the change of a tide. "All right, that's it," he barked. His voice cut across the site, carrying authority. "Secure every last board. No shortcuts. Tools in the truck. Nobody leaves until I check it myself." His men moved quickly, their hands sure. Hammers slammed ropes, tightened ladders folded down. These were men who had learned survival through repetition. Boss Carlos. The newest of the crew looked at him nervously. "If we hurry, I could still make it home." "No," David interrupted firm. "Storm's moving faster than they said. You ride with me if you need a lift." Carlos hesitated, but the look in David's eyes ended the debate. Across town, the middle school had already begun lockdown procedures. Emily Miller texted again. "Dad, they've got us in the basement. Ms. Rodriguez says it's safer here. We've got snacks and flashlights. Don't worry." David's thumb hovered over the screen. He typed, "Stay with your teacher. I'll come for you the second it's clear." Then he added another heart, just in case. He pocketed the phone and caught a glimpse of the glove compartment through his windshield. The old leather photo album rested inside. He thought of Sarah's handwriting under those storm photos. "We endure. We rebuild." He whispered it to himself like a prayer. At the same hour, Isabella Reyes sat in her Porsche at the edge of her long, winding driveway. The estate's gates groaned open, fighting the rising wind. She gripped the steering wheel tighter than she'd meant to, her knuckles pale. Her phone buzzed with a call from Richards. She let it ring once, twice, then answered with clipped efficiency. "Miss Reyes, where are you?" "You mustn't. I'm going into town," she cut him off. Her tone brooked no argument. "Ma'am, it's dangerous. If you want to contribute, call in more aid teams. Contact FEMA. Don't put yourself." But she ended the call before he could finish. Her father's voice rang in her memory again. "Build the fortress higher, little dragon." But walls hadn't saved her last night. A stranger's arms had. She shifted gears and pressed down on the accelerator. By late afternoon, Cedar Grove was already sinking into twilight, though the clock read only 4. Rain slashed sideways. Winds snapped tree branches like matchsticks. The air sirens shrieked an eerie rising wail that made everyone's stomachs twist. David's crew packed into their trucks, but he stayed behind, double-checking. Then Carlos's voice broke the rhythm. "Boss, my car, she won't start." David didn't think twice. He jerked his chin toward his pickup. "Get in. Let's move." As they pulled onto the road, the sky twisted into a bruise-colored vortex. Lightning clawed at the horizon. David's hands tightened around the wheel, steering through debris already scattering across the street. Carlos's voice shook. "My house is down that way." Woodframe David cut him off. His tone was steady, commanding. "It won't hold. We're going to the community center. Concrete foundations, basements. That's your best shot." Carlos swallowed hard, then nodded. He knew better than to argue. Inside the community center, volunteers scrambled. Families packed in, children clutching stuffed animals, the elderly leaning heavily on walkers. The building itself groaned under the wind, windows rattling in their frames. The air smelled of fear, sweat dust, the faint copper of blood from someone's split lip. David's truck skidded into the lot just as the first funnel cloud descended from the sky. The sight hit him like a punch, a massive rotating column of black fury, wider than the main street itself. He slammed the gear into park. "Go," he shouted, hauling Carlos by the arm. Together they sprinted through the rain, shoving into the lobby where chaos reigned. Everybody downstairs, David's voice boomed. He pushed, pulled, directed. Years of running crews translated seamlessly into saving lives. Mothers clutched toddlers closer. Teenagers helped guide the elderly. A ceiling tile cracked. Dust rained down. People screamed. David's instincts sharpened. He looked up, scanning for structural weaknesses. Eyes tracking every sound, every fracture. Away from the windows, move. And then through the sheets of rain slashing across the entrance, he saw her. A woman stumbling, her expensive coat ripped, her hair plastered to her face, her movement sluggish as if every step cost her. Isabella Reyes. She had made it to Cedar Grove after all, and she was seconds away from being crushed beneath the collapsing roof. "Hold on," David bellowed, already running toward her. The storm roared in his ears, drowning every sound but the thundering of his own pulse. He reached her just as a support beam gave way overhead. Without thinking, he threw himself forward, slamming into her with all his weight, carrying her down to the ground. The beam crashed where she had stood, splintering in two, the floor cracking under the impact. Dust filled the air, choking, blinding. She coughed violently against his chest, clinging to him. "Are you hurt?" he shouted above the storm. She shook her head weakly, eyes wide with terror. He grabbed her hand, firm, unyielding. "Basement. Now!" Her fingers squeezed back. Together they pushed through the chaos, crawling, staggering, fighting against the storm that wanted to rip the building apart, beam by beam. And in that moment, as the world around them splintered, their fates tangled tighter than either of them could know. The roar of the storm swallowed every other sound. It was as if the sky itself had opened and was trying to pull the whole world into its throat. The walls of the community center shook. The concrete trembled beneath their feet. David Miller tightened his grip on the woman's hand, refusing to let go. Her palm was smaller than his, softer, but it clung with a desperation that nearly matched his own strength. Dust stung his eyes, splinters cut across his forearm. The wind howled so fiercely that it felt like invisible claws raking across his back. "Stay low," he shouted, though the words were half swallowed by the chaos. She stumbled, her knees buckling as her high-heeled shoes snapped under the pressure. She went down hard, gasping, clutching her ankle. David dropped instantly beside her, blocking falling plaster with his own shoulders. "Can you stand?" Her eyes flicked to him, wide and disoriented. Blood streaked across her cheek, matting against strands of black hair. I don't... You can." His tone was sharp, commanding. Not cruel, never cruel, but decisive, the voice of a man who had carried people through storms before. "We don't stop here. We move." For a second she simply stared at him as if she couldn't reconcile the raw certainty in his eyes with the crumbling world around them. Then she nodded, swallowing hard. David slid an arm under her shoulders, hauling her up. She leaned against him, light compared to the beams of lumber he'd carried for decades, yet heavier than she looked when her weight sagged with fear. The stairwell to the basement loomed only 30 feet ahead. 30 feet, but each step felt like a mile. A ceiling tile dropped with a crash. Children screamed from below. Volunteers shouted frantic directions. "Keep moving!" Away from the walls. David pushed forward, dragging her along his boots, sliding on slick concrete dust. Another support beam groaned, bending, cracking. He shoved her down just in time as it collapsed across their path, blocking half the hallway. "Go under," he ordered, dropping to his knees. She hesitated, glancing at the narrow crawl space beneath the beam, the sharp splinters, the dust choking the air. "I know time." He dropped onto his belly, shoving debris aside. "Now." Her breath hitched, but she obeyed, crawling after him, her torn coat snagging on nails, threads, ripping. He pulled her the last few feet, gripping her arms like she was family, not a stranger. They stumbled to their feet again, staggering through the final stretch to the door. He slammed his shoulder against the heavy steel, and it gave way, swinging open into the dim basement. The sudden relative quiet was startling. The storm still roared above, but down here it was muffled, distant, as if they had ducked under the ocean while a war raged overhead. Dozens of faces turned toward them, neighbors, children, old men, dust-streaked, wide-eyed, survivors. David guided the woman inside his hand, still firm on her arm. "You made it," whispered Mrs. Rodriguez, Emily's teacher, clutching a flashlight. She looked David up and down, then the trembling woman at his side. "Get her seated. She's bleeding." I'm fine, Isabella rasped, her voice cultured even through exhaustion. David shot her a look. You're not fine. Sit. For once, she didn't argue. She lowered herself onto a bench against the wall, breathing hard. Blood dripped from her temples, staining the collar of her blouse. Emily spotted her father then, and with a cry, she sprinted across the crowded room. Dad. She threw herself into his arms. He caught her, holding her tight, burying his face in her hair. Relief washed over him like a flood stronger than any storm. You're safe, he whispered. Thank God. Emily pulled back, her eyes scanning him. You're bleeding. Dad, you're back? It's nothing, he said quickly, though the sting burned deeper now that the adrenaline eased. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. As long as you're okay. She clung to him, then noticed the stranger sitting nearby. Her brow furrowed. Who's she? David hesitated, glancing at the woman. Their eyes met briefly. For a second, the whole room, the whole storm seemed to fade. But before he could answer, the building above them groaned again, louder this time. The walls shuddered, dust rained from the ceiling. The children whimpered, Everyone stay calm. David's voice rang out. He stepped into the center of the room, commanding without trying. We're in the strongest part of the building. Stick together. We'll ride this out. The woman Isabella watched him. Something unreadable passed across her face. He wasn't in charge because of money or power. He was in charge because people believed him. Because he gave them strength just by standing there, steady as a rock in the storm. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she found herself gripping the hem of her coat tighter, her pulse quickening. The pocket watch in David's pocket ticked steadily against his side. His father's watch. His grandfather's before that. Generations of Millers had survived storms with that watch marking the seconds. But then with a shuddering crack overhead, time seemed to bend. A beam slammed somewhere above. The floor shook, and the watch stopped. 5:47 p.m. The world above them was ripped apart, but in that basement, with his daughter in his arms and a stranger's wide eyes locked on him. David Miller had no idea that the moment would change the course of all their lives. Silence didn't come all at once. It arrived in uneven breaths, like the storm itself was catching its own breath, then losing it again in one last howl. The concrete walls quivered, the lights flickered, and finally the basement settled into a low animal hum. The roar above turned into a long growl, then a far-off rumble, then the hollow patter of rain finding cracks it had never known before. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else started crying quietly into their sleeve. A flashlight clicked off, then on again, as if its owner didn't trust the dark to stay gone. David didn't move for a few seconds. He stood with his hand still wrapped around the woman's, the stranger, whose pulse he could feel beating against his palm. He felt the small tremor in her fingers, the way a trembling bird tests its wings after a fall. You all right? He asked softly. Her throat worked before a sound came out. I think so. Good. He breathed out slow and careful. We wait. Let the first rush pass, then we'll help get people out. Her eyes lifted to his. Up close, he could see the shock beginning to recede, leaving intelligence and a wary composure behind. He'd seen that look before in men on job sites, after scaffolds failed, in neighbors after funerals. The body survived first, the mind arrived later. She let go of his hand with a gentle, lingering squeeze. Thank you. He nodded once. Words felt too big and clumsy in a room where so much had nearly ended. Dad Emily's voice threaded through the basement like light through dust. She moved closer again, touching his elbow, checking the tear in his shirt near his shoulder blade. Does it hurt? Only when it rains, he said, forcing a crooked grin. It's raining, she deadpanned. The corners of her mouth fought not to smile. He chuckled, then winced as the movement pulled at the cut. Right. We'll clean it when we get topside. Around them, neighbors were already working. That's what Cedar Grove did, shift from fear to hands, from shock to action. Mr. Wilson, from the market, handed out water bottles. A teenager in a varsity jacket tore bedsheets into bandages. Mrs. Rodriguez moved from child to child, checking scrapes, doling out comfort like a practiced medic. The stranger sat straighter, watching. Her breathing steadied. The polished edges of her life, the kind that made a person easy to recognize on a magazine cover, blurred beneath dust and a cut that had started to clot. But the steadiness was there. The spine. He saw it in the way her gaze cataloged what was needed, who was shivering, who was bleeding, who needed a steady voice more than a bandage. Blankets, David called. Anything warm. A stack materialized from a supply closet. He thrust one toward her. Hold this. She took it without question, moving to a family with a toddler who'd cried herself hoarse. The woman knelt, wrapped the little girl with a care that surprised even herself, and murmured something so soft only the child heard. The child's shoulders eased, her eyelids drooped. The stranger looked up at David over the child's head. The look said, "I can help." "I will." He nodded. The floor thrummed like a living thing beneath his boots, the building registering every gust, every distant crack. Then finally, blessedly, came stillness heavy enough to trust. A volunteer in a yellow vest pressed to the door, listened, then cracked it an inch. No new screaming wind rushed in, just a low rain and the smell of wet dirt and ruptured pine. "Okay," David called, voice steady and audible in the hush. We move slow. First the elderly, then the kids. If the stairs look compromised, we find another route. No pushing. We're all getting out. They rose in segments. The room made a sound he'd never forget, like a choir of chair legs and careful footsteps, a town deciding together to live. He caught the stranger's eye one more time. "You ready?" She nodded. "Yes," then lower so only he heard, "I won't forget." He didn't know what to do with that sentence, so he just said, "Let's go." They climbed. The stairwell smelled of wet concrete, pulverized drywall, the faint metallic ghost of electricity, somewhere it shouldn't be. David took the steps first, testing his weight on each one. Emily followed right behind him, one hand on his jacket. The stranger came next, a palm on the rail, her breath slow and even. The door at the top groaned open. They stepped into a different town. The lobby they'd run through hours or minutes ago looked like a picture ripped in half. One wall gaped open to the outside. The floor wore a skin of glittering glass dust. A stop sign had speared itself through a notice board filled with flyers for pancake breakfasts and Little League tryouts and lost cats named Peanut. Outside, cedar branches lay like the bodies of felled soldiers. Streetlights leaned at drunk angles. The sky had the dazed look of someone who'd cried too hard for too long, all color rinsed out. People emerged in twos and threes. A man whispered, "Oh God," like he'd never used the words before. A woman covered her mouth with both hands, seeing her front porch 3 blocks away. Sirens Dopplered past toward someone else's worst moment. David took stock. His brain did what it always did, measure, assess, list. Who needed ambulances right now? Who needed a ride? Where a tarp would save a living room, where a chainsaw would save a roof. Then Emily's fingers squeezed his sleeve. "Dad." He followed her gaze. The stranger had stepped into what remained of the vestibule. The wind fingered her torn coat. She turned a slow circle, taking in the damage, the faces, the ruin. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out nothing useful. No one item could undo this. The gesture alone told him what she wished she had, a tool that could right a whole town. "Ma'am?" A firefighter approached, radio clipped to his shoulder, ash streaking his cheek. "You hurt?" "I'm okay," she said. "Others need you more." The firefighter nodded once. "Thanks for not making me waste seconds," and moved on. David felt Emily lean into him. Will we have a house?" He swallowed. The answer that wanted to come out was a long, helpless, "I don't know." He reached into his pocket instead and found the familiar cold circle. The pocket watch. It was still. 5:47 p.m., frozen, but solid. "We have this," he said. "We have us. Houses can be rebuilt." He forced a small smile he wanted her to believe. "We endure. We rebuild." She repeated it, her voice a fragile echo. "We endure. We rebuild." The stranger watched them. He didn't know why the sight of a father and daughter clinging to a sentence could make his throat hurt more than any debris had. But it did. David, Mrs. Rodriguez called breaking the moment we've set up triage under the overhang. "I need strong backs and calm voices." "On it," he said. He turned to the stranger, an impulse he didn't examine guiding him. "You good to help?" "Yes." She didn't ask for instructions, she asked for work. "Tell me where." "Blankets, water, a list of anyone who needs meds. Start there." She moved. People who didn't know her name took water from her hand and didn't care about pedigree or portfolio. Children let her check their foreheads for fever. No reservation in their big, storm-bright eyes. An old man with a farm wife's hands thanked her by touching her elbow, a gesture that landed on her like a benediction. She felt a new ache open in her old, really, but long walled off. If she'd had words for it, she might have called it belonging. She didn't. She just kept working. Dusk thickened, then slowly, gently slid into night. Floodlights buzzed to life along Main Street, casting island circles of safety. A church opened its hall. A diner gave away coffee until the urns went dry. Somewhere a generator coughed, and then steadied like a stubborn heart refusing to quit. By the time the first hard decisions settled, who could stay with whom, what roads were passable, which roofs were lost for good, the stranger had vanished from the center of the overhang bustle. David scanned instinctively like a man who'd misplaced a tool he wasn't ready to admit he depended on. He found her near the edge of the parking lot, coat pulled tight, phone to her ear. The glow from the screen lit her face like a candle in an old painting. Her posture said business. Her eyes said something else. When she ended the call, she didn't rejoin the groups. She came to him. "You're bleeding through the bandage," she said softly. "Occupational hazard. I'm leaving teams." A small correction. I've sent for teams, engineers, contractors, assessment specialists. They're good." He frowned a little, not in suspicion, but in the way of a man calibrating. "From where?" "From everywhere." She held his gaze, and for a breath he saw the person the world might see when they said her name. Then it was gone, replaced by the woman he'd dragged beneath a beam. "They'll be here at dawn." He didn't ask how. He didn't ask who she was. The question lived in his eyes, but he let it keep living there unspoken. "Thank you," he said, simple as a nail. She nodded, the smallest bow. "Thank you." She returned like a vow. "For more than my life." A volunteer called his name, a second-floor bedroom with a trap door. He looked back to her, wanting to say one more thing and not knowing what it was. "Be careful," she said, reading the untidy need in his expression like blueprints. "You too." He sprinted toward the ladder crew. When he looked over his shoulder a minute later, she was gone. No drama. No goodbye. Just gone. As if the storm had taken her and left an idea of her behind. Night thinned into the pale gray of almost morning. Raindrops ticked against sheet metal. The town spoke in murmurs and footsteps and the tired laughter people use as a bridge over fear. At 4:32 a.m., Emily fell asleep sitting up her head on David's shoulder, her hand inside his jacket pocket, fingers curled around the cold shell of the pocket watch, like it could keep time safe. He brushed damp hair from her forehead, memorizing the weight of her. He knew what had to happen next. She needed stability he couldn't guarantee by sunset. He needed both hands free to rebuild what could be rebuilt. So an aunt in Oklahoma City, a spare room, a week, maybe 2. The thought cut him, but he sharpened himself against it. By dawn, the rain eased to a mist. A convoy of pickup trucks rumbled in with lumber and bottled water. A bus from a church 30 miles away hissed to a stop and exhaled volunteers in windbreakers. A National Guard Humvee rolled through the intersection tires, pushing aside last night's branches with patient authority. David stood, bones aching, eyes sanded by no sleep, and watched the light find the faces of the people he loved. The town looked older this morning, lined, bruised, but upright. He felt the absence of the woman like an unfinished sentence. Carlos clapped his shoulder. "Boss, we're forming teams." "Yeah," David said, voice scraping into strength. He lifted his chin toward the half-collapsed community center. "Start there." He didn't see the black SUVs yet. He didn't see the hard hats with logos he didn't recognize or the engineers stepping down with tablets already pinging with plans. He didn't see the woman clean bandage on her temple, stepping out to face a town as something more than a mystery. That would come. For now, he put his hands to work. For now, Cedar Grove drew its first steady breath, and somewhere beyond the edge of sight, the future rolled closer on quiet tires. Dawn crept slow and thin over Cedar Grove, painting the wreckage in a pale golden light that softened nothing. Roofs sagged. Trees lay twisted like broken matchsticks. The smell of splintered pine and wet earth clung to the air, mingled with the faint tang of gasoline from overturned trucks. David Miller stood in what had once been his front yard boots, sinking into the mud. His house, his and Emily's safe place, was half gone. A roof ripped clean away. Walls crumbled. His daughter's drawings scattered like confetti, plastered wet against the fence. His hand clenched tighter around the useless house key he still carried, turning it over and over in his palm. It felt heavier than steel, heavier than grief. Emily was gone for the moment. He'd sent her with her aunt to Oklahoma City at first light. She hadn't wanted to leave. She'd clutched her backpack of treasures, her old field trip permission slip, her card that read, "World's best dad like life preservers." But he'd insisted. She needed safety. He needed both hands free to fight for their survival. Now, with her absence pressing against him like a missing heartbeat, he turned toward the sound of boots on gravel. Dave. Carlos trudged up the path, his own eyes hollow from no sleep. His house hadn't fared better, leveled, gone, but his voice held a strange steadiness as he said, "You saved my life, man. My house is gone, but I'm still here, because of you." David shook his head. "I just drove. You listened." Carlos gripped his shoulder. "Don't sell yourself short." David wanted to argue, but then, down the block, an engine rumbled that didn't belong. A convoy of black SUVs rolled in, followed by construction vehicles bearing sleek logos no one in Cedar Grove had ever seen. The sight froze everyone. Volunteers paused mid-shovel. Neighbors stopped stacking broken boards. It looked like the storm had sent in another kind of force. SUV doors opened. Men in suits stepped out, their tablets glowing with blueprints and maps. Behind them, workers in fresh hard hats unloaded equipment with precise efficiency. And then she appeared. The woman from the storm. The stranger he'd shielded with his body. Only she didn't look like a stranger anymore. Her torn coat had been replaced by a tailored jacket. Her temple was neatly bandaged. Her posture was regal, commanding, yet softened by something the storm had carved into her. "Is that?" Carlos whispered, lowering his voice as if the name itself carried weight. "Man, that's Isabella Reyes, the billionaire. The one with the mansion out past the ridge. You're telling me that's who you pulled out of the wreckage?" David's throat tightened. He didn't answer. He just watched her as she moved among the workers, her voice calm but firm, pointing out where structures needed reinforcement, where the ground had shifted. She wasn't just visiting, she was directing. A suited man approached David, then tablet in hand. "Mr. Miller." David blinked, suddenly self-conscious of his mud-streaked clothes and 3-day beard. "Yeah. Miss Reyes would like a word. If you have a moment?" Before David could muster a reply, another voice cut in low and even. "Mr. Miller can speak for himself." She stood there just a few feet away now. The chaos of the sight seemed to mute around her. Though she carried the same air of command as the night before, there was something else in her tone, a flicker of the woman who had clung to his hand in the basement. She extended her hand toward him. "I believe I owe you my life," she said simply, "and I'd like to discuss how I might repay that debt." David hesitated, staring at her hand. His instincts warred the part of him that distrusted wealth, and the part of him that remembered her fear, raw and human. He took her hand. Her grip was firm. "Miss Reyes," he began, but she raised her other hand slightly, halting him. "Please." "Isabella." He nodded once. "Isabella. I've spent the morning reviewing the damage," she continued, her gaze sweeping over the broken town around them. "This community needs more than emergency funds. It needs rebuilding, real rebuilding, and I have the resources to make that possible. What I don't have is—" her eyes locked on his. "Someone who knows Cedar Grove's heart. Someone who understands that not everything worth saving can be measured in dollar signs." David exhaled slowly. He thought of Emily's face when she'd seen their ruined home. He thought of the neighbors packed into that basement holding hands in the dark. He thought of Sarah's words preserved in fading ink. "We endure. We rebuild." He looked back at Isabella. "You're offering help." Her eyes softened just slightly. "I'm offering a partnership, if you'll have it." Behind them, workers were already fanning out, assessing, organizing. The town buzzed with cautious energy, half disbelief, half hope. The useless key in David's pocket seemed to grow heavier still. It no longer unlocked the door of a home. But maybe it could unlock something new. He tightened his grip around the cool metal, then looked at her again. "Where do we start?" he asked. The morning sun had burned its way through the lingering storm clouds, throwing long stripes of light across what was left of Cedar Grove. It was the kind of light that should have meant renewal, but the wreckage on every street corner made it feel almost cruel. David Miller stood in the middle of the battered community center, a set of blueprints spread across a folding table. His calloused hands traced lines that seemed more like riddles than answers. The paper smelled of fresh ink, of expensive drafting boards, of something far bigger than any job he had ever seen. "This has to be a mistake," he muttered under his breath. Carlos leaned over his shoulder, squinting at the drawings. "Boss, that's not a mistake. Look at the materials list. That's military-grade steel. And these specs," he tapped at a section with his dirty finger, "this thing's built to survive a direct hit from an F5. I didn't even know that was possible." David shook his head. "Somebody must have sent the wrong package. These aren't for us." But then his eyes caught the letter clipped to the corner of the plans. His company's name. In bold. Miller Construction Primary Contractor, Cedar Grove Rebuilding Initiative. His throat went dry. Carlos whistled low. "Man, your name's right there." David pulled the letter closer. He read the words twice, 3 times, but they didn't change. Whoever had orchestrated this massive rebuilding plan hadn't chosen the big firms from Tulsa or Oklahoma City. They'd chosen him, his small, struggling crew. Why, he whispered. Carlos laughed, a little disbelieving. Because you dragged a billionaire out of a storm cellar, maybe David's gut clenched at the mention. Isabella. He could still feel the weight of her in his arms, still remember the way her eyes had met his when the ceiling had come down. He shook the thought away. This wasn't about her. This was about Cedar Grove. By noon, word had spread. Wilson's Market down the street had its own stack of plans, now detailed designs for rebuilding, complete with solar arrays and vertical farming features that seemed ripped out of a science fiction magazine. The school board had been contacted too. They were looking over proposals for an entire new STEM wing for the middle school. It wasn't just a rebuilding effort. It was a reinvention. David pinched the bridge of his nose, staring at the strange, elegant lines of the new community center design. The numbers in the budget column made his head swim. This was so far beyond him, so far beyond what his crew usually did with splintered lumber and rusted nails. And yet there it was, his name, his company. The door banged open. A delivery truck rattled to a stop outside, tires crunching over gravel. 2 men in crisp uniforms jumped out, unloading toolboxes and equipment onto the curb. David stepped outside, confusion written across his face. "What's this?" The driver checked his tablet. "Delivery for Miller Construction." David blinked. "I didn't order anything?" "All paid for," the driver replied, tapping his screen. "Through the Disaster Relief Fund. Sign here." David stared at the equipment. High-end professional-grade tools gleamed in the sunlight. A laser level that probably cost more than his monthly mortgage. Saws sharper than anything he'd ever owned. Replacement sets for every tool he had sold in the last desperate year. His hand shook as he signed. He picked up the laser level, feeling the weight of it, the balance. It was perfect. Too perfect. And his mind went unbidden to Isabella. Later, as the crew gathered again around the blueprints, David tried to steady himself. Carlos was grinning like a man who'd stumbled into a miracle. "This is it, boss. Look at this part. Job training programs. Local hiring guaranteed. Whoever's behind this, they want half the town working. Not just us. Everyone." David traced the paragraph with his finger. "Local hiring, minimum 70%. On-site training to be provided. Priority given to displaced residents." His chest tightened. This wasn't charity. This was a lifeline. Carlos elbowed him gently. "You think this has her fingerprints on it?" "Ms. Reyes." David didn't answer immediately. He thought of the look she had given him in the basement, the look of someone who had seen the strength of a town and wanted to be part of it. He thought of the way she had said partnership. Finally, he said quietly, "If it is, she doesn't want us to know. Not yet." Carlos chuckled. "Then she's doing it right. Folks don't want a handout. They want a hand up." David folded the blueprint carefully. His hands were steady now. "All right," he said. We'll do what we always do. We build it right. We build it to last. His eyes drifted almost without meaning to toward the ridge in the distance. Her estate rose there, shadowed but visible. Somewhere up there he suspected Isabella Reyes was watching, and somehow he knew this was only the beginning. The Bell Street coffee shop had survived the storm with only a cracked window and a leaky roof. For a town where entire streets had been stripped bare, it stood almost untouched like an island of normal life in a sea of ruin. The air inside smelled of strong coffee and cinnamon scones. The chatter was subdued, careful as neighbors nursed their mugs while swapping stories of near misses and lost roofs. The hum of a generator out back rattled, faintly powering the lights that flickered but held. David Miller sat in his usual corner booth, though nothing about his life felt usual anymore. Spread across the table were contractor bids, proposals, and more blueprints than he'd ever thought he'd see in his life. The papers looked surreal against the chipped tabletop and the little receipt sitting beside his cup of black coffee. He pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaustion pressing behind his eyes. He had not slept properly in days. His daughter Emily was still in Oklahoma City, safe with her aunt, but her absence gnawed at him. He missed the sound of her sneakers squeaking on the kitchen floor, missed the way she asked questions faster than he could answer them. The doorbell chimed. David looked up, expecting another neighbor in work clothes. Instead, the whole room went quiet. Isabella Reyes walked in. She wasn't wearing the tailored armor of a CEO today. No designer suit, no entourage of assistants. Just a simple sweater, a soft blouse and slacks that probably still cost more than his truck, but looked disarmingly ordinary. She held a cappuccino in her hand, steam rising in the dim light. Conversations faltered. Forks froze halfway to mouths. In Cedar Grove, a billionaire walking into the coffee shop was like seeing a swan land in a cornfield. David rose halfway, startled. Ms. Reyes Isabella, she corrected gently, sliding into the seat across from him before he could finish standing. Please. Stay seated. I've had enough formality this week to last me a lifetime. The regulars tried not to stare, but their eyes betrayed them. David could feel the whole room leaning in with curiosity. Hope I'm not interrupting, she said, gesturing to his scattered paperwork. Just bids for the community center project. His tone was careful. His eyes searched hers. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Her lips curved into the faintest smile. I may have heard something. Something. He leaned back, folding his arms. Strange thing is, every time I try to trace where all this is coming from, funding tools, the contracts, I hit walls of corporate subsidiaries. Almost like someone's trying not to be noticed. She lifted her cup, took a small sip, then set it down again. Sometimes the most effective help is the kind that empowers others to help themselves. A pause. Her gaze softened, though I'm beginning to wonder if I've gotten that backwards. David studied her, trying to reconcile the woman who had trembled in the storm with the one sitting calmly across from him now. He opened his mouth to respond. The door chimed again. Dad. Emily burst into the shop, still wearing her backpack, cheeks flushed from the chilly air outside. Her eyes lit up at the sight of him, then froze when she saw who sat across the table. Her mouth fell open. She stammered. You're her. From the news videos. David rubbed his forehead. Emily. But Isabella was already smiling. And you must be the young scientist I've heard about. She pulled out another chair. Come sit. Emily blinked. You know about me. I make it my business to know about bright young minds. Isabella's smile warmed, especially ones who ace physics tests while helping run tornado relief at their school. Emily's eyes widened, thrilled and bewildered. Dad, did you hear that? She knows about me? David sat back helpless against his daughter's excitement. In minutes, the girl and the billionaire were deep in conversation. Emily rattled off questions about robotics and quantum computing, her hands flying as she sketched ideas on napkins. Isabella listened intently, nodding, asking thoughtful questions, explaining complex concepts with a clarity that left Emily glowing. Dad, Emily burst out. Suddenly, did you know they're building a real quantum research center here with actual quantum computers? That's still in the planning stages, Isabella said smoothly, though her eyes flicked toward David with a flicker of apology. A lot depends on community support and local partnerships. David caught the message beneath her words. Local partnerships. That's what she was offering him. Is that what we're calling it? He asked quietly. She met his gaze without flinching. What would you call it? Before he could answer, his phone buzzed insistently. A construction site emergency, deliveries ahead of schedule, foundation questions, too many fires to ignore. He stood reluctantly. Duty calls. He glanced at Emily. You'll come home for dinner, right? Emily looked at him with pleading eyes. Dad, please, can I stay with her? Just for the afternoon? She said she could show me quantum simulations, real ones. David hesitated. Every instinct screamed to be cautious, but he remembered the basement. He remembered Isabella's hand gripping his in the dark. Be home for dinner, he said finally, and don't talk her ear off about your robot designs. Actually, Isabella said, rising gracefully, I'd love to hear about them. Together they walked out, Emily chattering, Isabella listening with genuine interest. David stood for a long moment in the emptying coffee shop, staring at the napkin sketches his daughter had left behind. The receipt sat beside them, an artifact of an ordinary morning in the middle of something extraordinary. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the blinds of Isabella Reyes's study, drawing pale stripes across the polished oak floor. On her desk sat a thick business proposal, its crisp pages stacked neatly between gleaming brass weights. Across the top in bold lettering read, Cedar Grove Innovation Partnership. David's construction company was listed right there, his name printed as primary development partner. He sat stiffly in the leather chair opposite her desk, his work boots still carrying dust from the half-cleared streets. The room smelled faintly of leather ink and some delicate floral scent that felt out of place against the bruised exhaustion in his bones. You've been planning this since before the tornado, David said finally, his rough voice breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. Isabella leaned back, her fingers tracing the edges of the proposal. Afternoon light touched her cheek, softening the sharpness that money and magazines had always captured. The facility, yes, she admitted. But the partnership? Her eyes lifted to meet his. That part evolved. The words hung between them. David looked down at the pages again. He skimmed lines about integrated smart systems, sustainable design, local hiring priorities. It was visionary. It was impossible. It was Cedar Grove rewritten from the ground up. Why me? He asked, voice low. There are companies twice the size of mine with more experience, more resources. Why put this on me? Isabella rose from her chair, walking to a wall of monitors that displayed progress reports and maps of the town. Images of collapsed houses, repair zones, and projected rebuilds shifted across the screens. She tapped one, enlarging a photo of neighbors carrying lumber shoulder to shoulder. When the storm hit, I saw something in Cedar Grove, she said softly. People didn't wait for orders. They didn't ask who would pay. They moved. They helped. They trusted one another. That kind of strength can't be bought. She turned back to him. And I saw you at the center of it. David shook his head. That wasn't leadership. That was just doing what needed to be done. Exactly. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. And that's why it worked. Her words unsettled him, not because they weren't true, but because they brushed against something he had buried, an instinct to lead to build that had been dulled by bills and cut hours and endless small defeats. Jenny hasn't stopped talking about your lab, he said finally, looking up. She's already sketching upgrades for her robot. You've lit a fire in her. She's brilliant, Isabella replied without hesitation. They all are the kids in that makeshift classroom, dreaming up solutions while the world calls them too small, too ordinary. I want them to know their future can be built here, not just somewhere else. David studied her closely. This isn't just a business deal for you, is it? For a heartbeat, she said nothing. Then her gaze dropped to the desk. The board will tell you otherwise. They'll say it's numbers, projections, market share. But no. She raised her eyes again, clear and steady. Now it's more than that. This is about proving a different way is possible. David leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. If we do this your way, the board's not going to like it. They don't already, Isabella said with a dry chuckle. But I'm learning that walls, corporate or otherwise, cost more than they protect. His hand rested on the table, rough fingers brushing the edge of the proposal. It wasn't just a contract, it was a test. He met her gaze. If I say yes, I have conditions. Her brows lifted. Such as local hiring stays at 70% minimum. The community center's programs get priority funding. And he paused, leaning forward, no more hiding behind shell companies or subsidiaries. If we're partners out in the open. For the first time, Isabella hesitated. The air in the room shifted. She looked away toward the windows where cedar groves stretched beyond her estate's walls. Her father's old mantra echoed in her memory, build the fortress higher, little dragon. But hadn't the storm proved that fortresses were useless against what truly mattered? Her voice was quiet when it came. The board won't like that last condition. Probably not, David said. His eyes didn't waver. But I think you do. Silence stretched. Then slowly she nodded. Yes, I do. David extended his hand across the polished surface of her desk. Isabella looked at it for a moment, then placed her own hand in his. The touch was firm, steady. Not the frantic grip of the basement, not the polite handshake of strangers, but something new. For a flicker of time, it felt like the storm had returned not in fury, but in raw power. Two people who had found each other in chaos, now choosing to build something together in the calm that followed. The partnership agreement sat between them, but it was no longer just paper and ink. It was a blueprint for trust, for change, for something neither of them had fully named yet. And as their hands clasped, both of them knew whatever storms lay ahead, they would face them side by side. Morning didn't so much arrive as glare. The sky over Cedar Grove was a hard, cloudless blue, the kind of blue that felt like it was judging you too bright for the grit and ruin on the ground. Somewhere a generator coughed itself awake. A hammer tapped. Then another. The town stretched the sleep out of its arms and got back to work. And on a stack of lumber outside the community center beside a thermos of stale coffee and a tape measure scuffed by 100 jobs, David Miller stared at a tabloid headline that might as well have been a siren. Billionaire and the Builder. Tornado Romance in Small-Town America. Below the words, a zoomed-in photo of him and Isabella, heads bent over blueprints close enough to share a breath. In the picture, her mouth was parted like she was about to say something intimate. His hand hovered over hers, almost touching. The camera had caught that in-between space and made it look like a confession. David's jaw tightened. Sweat ran down his spine, even though the morning wasn't hot yet. He had spent his adult life trying to be invisible to people who wrote headlines. Fix the roof, pay the bill, keep the kid fed. That was enough. His phone buzzed. A message from Emily. Dad, are you okay? People at Aunt Leah's showed me an article. It's dumb. I told them it's dumb. Are you okay? He typed back with thumbs that felt clumsy. I'm okay. Em, you good? I'm good. I love you more. He put the phone face down and looked at the envelope sitting on the lumber. He'd written the letter at dawn at his kitchen, what was left of it, while the coffee tasted like ash, and the birds sounded too cheerful for the day God had given him. To whom it may concern. The decision to terminate all contracts between Miller Construction and Reyes Quantum Development is mine alone. Any appearance of impropriety is my sole responsibility. He didn't know legal words. He didn't know how to talk to boards or reporters. But he knew how to take blame. He knew sacrifice. He knew what it meant to step in front of a falling beam. This letter was just another version of that. Step under it. Take the hit. Let Isabella and the town walk out whole. He folded the letter, slid it into the glove box of his truck, and told himself he would hand it to whoever needed it by noon. Then he went to work because work was the only language that ever steadied him. Saws whined, nails sunk home. The smell of cut pine drifted across the lot and mixed with the cold metal bite of generator exhaust. Carlos came up beside him with 2 coffees he'd scrounged from a church tent. You seen this? Carlos asked, lifting the paper like something that might stain your hands. I've seen it. Carlos shifted awkward. My cousin texted from Dallas. Says it's everywhere. Twitter TV. My aunt thinks you're famous now. David exhaled through his nose. I don't want famous. I want walls that don't leak. Carlos tried a joke smile, then let it drop. You want me to run interference with the cameras they're setting up by Bell Street? David didn't look. He didn't need to. He could feel the eyes like insects just beyond the barricades. No, just keep the crew moving. We've got trusses by 4. Carlos nodded, grateful for the clarity of a deadline, and jogged off. David turned to lift a beam with 2 teenagers' kids who'd showed up after school with hands blistered from trying to help. He liked them already. They didn't talk much. They watched his feet and copied where he put his weight. He was mid-count. 1-2 heave when a hush fell oddly circular, spreading outward from the street like a ripple pulled backwards. The hush had high heels in it. He didn't have to turn to know. He felt her before he saw her the way he'd felt the first pressure change before the tornado came down. Mr. Miller. He set the beam down gently, told the teenagers good, and straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. Isabella stood at the edge of the cordoned area, flanked by exactly no one. No suits, no assistants. Her hair was pulled back, a neat bandage clean on her temple. She wore black slacks and a cream blouse, and boots that had scuffs on them, now real scuffs earned on this ground. Behind her, not far, a small pack of cameras hovered like gulls. "Isabella," he said. She stepped closer, not caring that the gulls glided with her. "Walk with me." He looked at the work, looked at the clock, looked at the letter in his mind that had already been folded into his future. "I've got a schedule." 2 minutes, she said low. Not pleading, not ordering, asking with the urgency of someone who knew 2 minutes sometimes determined the rest of your life. He jerked his chin toward the south side of the site, where a half wall cast a skinny strip of shade. They moved there, his boots loud on gravel, her steps precise on broken concrete. The cameras tried to follow. Carlos lifted a palm, the universal sign for "give us the space." Amazingly, for a breath they did. Isabella didn't waste time. The board called an emergency meeting at dawn, she said. PR wants distance. Legal wants suspension of all community programs pending review. They used the word "compromised" 3 times in one sentence. David stared at the floodlight tower beyond her shoulder. "Tell them I'm out. That's what this is." He tapped the pocket above his heart, where no letter was, then realized the letter was in the truck, and felt foolish. "I wrote it." She breathed in, closed her eyes, opened them again. "Don't. It protects you. It doesn't. It stops them from gutting what we're doing. It gives them permission to." He worked his jaw. The generator throbbed. A mockingbird threw a string of notes from the top of a telephone pole that leaned like it had a secret. "You don't owe me your job," he said. "You don't owe me anything." She stepped closer, close enough he could see the storm had put new lines around her eyes. Not age, but something like truth. "I owe this town honesty. I owe myself honesty. And the honest thing is," she looked down at her palm, flexed it once, as if remembering how it felt in his "we built this together." "Not the headlines. This." She turned her head to the skeleton of the new community center. "I'm not letting a headline rewrite the architecture." He didn't know what to do with the heat that moved through his chest at that. It wasn't pride. It wasn't relief. It had notes of both, and something else, something he wouldn't name out loud with cameras listening. "David," she said, voice softening, "you ran into a collapsing building to save a stranger. You didn't ask who she was. You didn't ask if the optics were good. You just went. That's different. It's the same." He looked at the cameras now inching, feigning interest in a pile of rebar. He looked at her. He looked at his hands cut nicked sawdust in the lines. "They'll come for you," he said. "They already are." A little smile ghosted her mouth. "My father taught me to build walls tall enough that no one could. I thought that was strength. Turns out it's just lonely." She lifted her chin. "I'm done hiding behind walls. If they come, let them see all of it." He almost said, "All of what?" Then he didn't, because he knew. The work, the town, the grief and the grit, and the ridiculous stubborn hope. The way her hand didn't shake when it found his in a basement. A shout across the lot. "Miller, we need eyes on these joists," cut the moment. He nodded to the crew, held up a finger. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his flannel, out of habit, found nothing, and swore under his breath. "The letter," he said. "It's in the truck." She didn't reply. She walked past him, walked to his truck like it was her own, popped the passenger door with a tug that said she'd done harder things than break an American latch. Pulled the glove box open, found the envelope. She came back with it pinched between two fingers like something that might bite if coddled, and held it up where he and the cameras could see it. Isabella. She tore it in half. The sound was small, paper on air, but it cut through the sight like a clean bevel. She tore the halves again. And again. 4 white leaves, then 8, then confetti. The breeze took a few pieces and stuck them to a muddy tire. One snagged on his boot. Behind them a wave of shutter clicks. A ripple of whispers. "What are you doing?" he asked, even though the answer was obvious. "Protecting what matters," she said. "Not optics, not titles. The work." He stared at her. "You're going to war with your board because a small-town contractor wrote conditions on a deal. People like me never get—" "I'm going to war with my board," she said, "because I've spent my career building things that cut people out. Cedar Grove cuts people in. It's the first thing I've built that feels human." She swallowed once. "And because I'm tired of being brave in private and careful in public." He didn't realize he'd stepped closer until he felt the warmth of her shoulder, just this side of close enough to be a mistake. He remembered the weight of a beam, the weight of a little girl asleep against him, the weight of a town that needed more than a contractor could give. He measured himself against all that weight and said, "Okay." Her eyes softened. "Okay, we fight," he said. "We don't hide." He scooped a torn square of his own letter off his boot and flicked it into a trash bucket. "But we don't fight with statements. We fight with proof." She smiled. It wasn't the boardroom smile. It wasn't the magazine cover. It was human, a little crooked, like a window that stuck but still opened. Proof like what? Like a town hall. He gestured toward the rising frame toward Main Street, toward the church that had coffee. They watered down to make it stretch. You get your board to Cedar Grove. No slides. No spin. Just people. Mrs. Rodriguez. Wilson from the market. Those kids who've been running cable like pros. My crew. Your engineers. Emily. He cleared his throat. Let them talk. Let them show that this isn't charity. She finished, eyes bright with the click of an idea finding its mate. It's a model. Exactly. She nodded, already taking the next 10 steps in her head. I'll call Harrison, she said. He'll hate it. He'll come anyway. He can't resist a train he thinks might derail. He huffed something like a laugh. Then we lay new track under his feet. David. He looked back. Thank you, she said, for not letting me run to the fortress just because the world shouted. He wanted to say thank you for not letting me disappear just because the world pointed, but the words felt too big in his mouth. So he just lifted his chin. That was his yes. She turned to go. The gull cameras swarmed, then reshaped, sensing the prey was done bleeding for now. Carlos jogged up, eyes wide. Boss, did you see you know what? Never mind. He grinned, despite the knot of worry still riding his shoulders. Town hall. Town hall, David said. Tonight. Tonight. We don't give the storm 2 days to rethink us. Carlos whooped, clapped him on the back, and peeled off, yelling for bodies, chairs, a microphone that sometimes worked if you hit it twice on the side. Across the site, an older man in a VFW cap saluted Isabella as she passed. She startled, smiled, saluted back, without irony, and kept walking, phone to ear, already voice steady. Yes, Harrison. In Cedar Grove. If you want my vote in the meeting tomorrow, you see this with your own eyes tonight. By late afternoon, word had spread the old way, mouth to mouth, porch to porch, text threads that started with, hey, you hearing this, and ended with, I'll drive. The church hall's folding chairs appeared as if conjured. The quilt ladies put out a plate of cookies that looked like they'd been baked during Eisenhower, and survived this long by sheer will. The generator was coaxed into not stuttering. Someone found a flag and someone else found the extension cord that made the mic hum, then behave. David washed his hands at a hose spigot, watching the dirt swirl away like old thoughts. He scrubbed until his knuckles complained. He thought about the pocket watch in Emily's hand the night of the storm and the way time had chosen to stop at 5:47 p.m. Maybe he thought you didn't need time to start again for a life to move forward. Maybe you just needed to decide. He dried his hands on a shop rag and looked up. Isabella was at the far end of the lot, the sun burning a copper ring around her hair. She caught his eye across all that space and lifted 2 fingers in a kind of quiet salute. He lifted 2 in return. No words. They'd used enough for one day. Night came on with a softer mouth than the last time. Crickets tuned up in the weeds between the sidewalks. People filed into the hall, sat shoulder to shoulder, the air warm with breath. Worry, the stubborn perfume of hope. David took a seat in the front row left side. He kept his hands on his knees to keep from clenching them. Emily's last text blinked on his phone in his pocket like a heartbeat. I'm proud of you. On the makeshift stage, Isabella stepped to the mic. No paper, no slides, just her voice level and clear. Thank you for coming, she said. We have work to do, and people to convince, and a story to tell that is bigger than any headline. A murmur moved through the room. David felt it in his bones like he felt thunder before it sounded. He leaned forward, and the town leaned with him. Tomorrow would be the board. Tonight, it would be the truth. The church hall smelled of dust and floor polish, with a hint of coffee that had been brewing since morning and never poured out. Folding chairs scraped against the old wooden floor as neighbors packed into every row. The generator outside rumbled, keeping the lights alive, though they flickered, as if uncertain whether they belonged here. David Miller sat in the front row, his shoulders squared but his stomach coiled tight. His boots tapped softly, betraying nerves he didn't want anyone to see. All around him were familiar faces, Wilson from the market, with his apron still dusted in flour. Mrs. Rodriguez with a clipboard balanced on her lap. Carlos standing in the back with his arms folded and a grin that was half pride, half disbelief. And on stage stood Isabella Reyes. She didn't have a teleprompter or a slideshow or the polished armor of corporate theater, just a microphone that buzzed before clearing and her steady voice. The board arrives tomorrow, she began, her gaze sweeping the room. They want to suspend everything we've started here. Not just the quantum facility, but the training programs, the market rebuild, the school improvements, everything. A ripple of discontent swept through the hall. Mrs. Wilson from the corner stood holding a stack of receipts. Her voice quavered with both age and fire. My business is up 40% since this began. We're hiring kids, giving them real skills, and they want to take that away. More voices joined. My son got accepted to MIT, Carlos shouted from the back, his voice rough but proud. Because of the programming class they said was too advanced for a town like ours. That's what this project did. The room erupted with agreement. People lifted their hands, their voices carrying stories. Kids excited about physics, elderly quilters whose patterns had turned into algorithms, shop owners seeing growth after years of decline. Then from the middle row, a smaller voice spoke. Emily. She stood chin high, her ponytail trembling with the force of her own determination. I was going to leave Cedar Grove when I grew up. Everyone does. Because there's nothing here for kids who want to build the future. But now her eyes found her father, then Isabella. You've shown us we can build it right here. We can stay. We can matter. Silence followed, broken only by the hum of the lights. David's heart squeezed so hard it hurt. His daughter's words rang louder than any storm. Isabella's eyes glistened as she turned back to the crowd. You see, this is not about contracts. It's not about profits. It's about what happens when a community is given the tools to create its own future. Tomorrow the board expects me to defend this with numbers. But tonight you've given me something stronger. Proof. Proof that this works. The crowd surged with applause, the kind that shakes a room from its foundations. David found himself on his feet, his voice joining the chorus. Then, let's show them. Heads turned. The applause dimmed just enough for his words to land. Let's show them what Cedar Grove really is. Not on paper, not in reports, but in people. Tomorrow when they arrive, we'll be ready. We'll show them our kids' robots, our businesses, our ideas. We'll show them this isn't charity. It's a blueprint for how things should be done. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded firmly. Motion to present as a unified community, she declared, her teacher's voice echoing. Seconded, Wilson said immediately, waving his apron. Unanimous. Someone else called, and laughter swept the hall, breaking the tension like sunlight through cloud. David glanced at Isabella. She was already smiling at him, not the cool, controlled smile of a CEO, but something warm, almost vulnerable. A smile that said, "We're in this together." Afterward, as the chairs clattered back into stacks and neighbors lingered over stale cookies and hot coffee, David found her bent over the blueprints again, tracing lines with the edge of her finger. Having second thoughts, he asked gently, stepping beside her. She shook her head. The opposite. I've spent my life building walls around everything I touch, my company, my money, myself. Tomorrow I'm asking them to tear all those walls down. She looked up at him with eyes equal parts fear and fire. It terrifies me. David's voice was steady. Then it's worth it. For a moment neither moved. The murmur of neighbors washed around them, a tide of voices weaving into something bigger than either of them could carry alone. When the last folding chair had been stacked, when the last cookie had been wrapped in napkins to take home. When the hall finally emptied, David and Isabella remained shoulders touching as they refined their plan for the board. No cameras, no headlines, no defenses. Just two people leaning over blueprints, daring to believe that what they had started in the rubble of a storm could stand against the wind still coming. Tomorrow would test them. Tonight they believed. The next morning, the town of Cedar Grove woke to the uneasy stillness that comes before confrontation. Outside the temporary offices, once a vacant bank building, the board of Reyes Quantum Technologies gathered in dark suits, their briefcases glinting in the sun. They were strangers here, their polished shoes crunching uneasily on gravel, their eyes sharp and calculating. Inside, legal papers waited on the conference table, restructuring documents. Cold efficient meant to sever Isabella's vision from the company she led. They spoke in the language of liability, governance, and risk. None of them spoke in the language of survival of heart of a town finding breath again. Miss Reyes Harrison, the lead director, said smoothly as she entered. His silver hair caught the light, his expression unreadable. We're offering you a reasonable out. You maintain nominal oversight of the quantum facility. We appoint a new management team. And all this, community entanglement gets sorted out. His hand flicked dismissively toward the window where Cedar Grove sprawled in stubborn recovery. Everyone saves face. Isabella stood at the head of the table, her hands resting lightly on the restructuring plan. The pen her father had given her, a heavy gold one engraved with her initials, lay beside the papers. Build walls high enough, little dragon, his voice echoed in memory. Nothing can touch you. But walls had failed her in that basement. Walls had nearly crushed her until someone without any walls had reached into the storm and pulled her out. No, she said simply. Harrison's brows arched. Excuse me, this isn't about saving face. It's about saving futures. Before he could respond, Richards, her loyal aide, entered with a tablet. His usually calm expression carried something different, an almost reluctant smile. You need to see this. He turned the tablet toward the board. On the screen, live security feeds showed Cedar Grove gathering. Dozens, then hundreds of people. Workers in hard hats, teachers leading students with handmade posters, quilting circles carrying bright fabrics, shop owners holding up sales reports, children tugging along their robot projects, wires and wheels glinting in the light. They were lining the street in a slow, steady march toward the temporary office, their footsteps raising dust that sparkled in the morning sun. What is this? Harrison demanded. This, Isabella said, her voice calm as what you're trying to erase. She walked to the window. Outside at the front of the line, she saw him. David Miller. Emily was beside him, clutching her robot like it was both shield and sword. Carlos walked with his son, who held up an acceptance letter like a banner. Mrs. Rodriguez carried a thick folder of lesson plans. Wilson from the market bore crates of vegetables grown under jury-rigged solar lights. Each step they took was a declaration. We are not charity, we are partners. This, Isabella said, turning back to the board, is Cedar Grove, and you will see them. Harrison leaned back, his jaw tightening. The shareholders will see better returns from lasting value than quarterly reports. Isabella cut in, her tone sharpening. She tapped the restructuring papers. These walls you're so eager to build between company and community progress, and people, they're outdated. The future isn't built by isolation. It's built by connection. The board shifted, uncomfortable. One muttered idealism. Isabella's gaze was steady. No, proof. She nodded to Richards, who switched the tablet feed to data collected over the past weeks. Crime rates dropping, education metrics climbing, local businesses. reporting growth patent applications filed from Cedar Grove's residents, students, hobbyists, shopkeepers. But the most compelling proof was still outside. The murmur of the crowd swelled through the glass like distant thunder. David lifted his eyes toward the window. Their gazes met. Across the distance, Isabella felt the same steadiness she'd clung to in the basement. His chin tilted the smallest nod and her chest loosened with resolve. "Restructure me if you must," she told the board. "I'll step down as CEO and lead community integration instead. Make Cedar Grove our new standard, or cling to your outdated models and lose not just this project, but the future." The pen lay between them. Harrison stared at it, then at the crowd pressing closer, their voices a tide of living proof. The choice wasn't just ink on paper anymore. It was flesh and blood, sweat and hope gathered in the streets of a broken town daring to rise again. And Isabella knew whatever line they drew today would mark more than a contract. It would mark the kind of world they were willing to build. The conference room door clicked shut. For a breath, no one spoke. The board sat with their pens poised like scalpels, their faces a study in practiced neutrality. Outside the glass, the murmuring line of Cedar Grove continued to grow, a living barometer of patience and resolve. Harrison steepled his fingers. "All right," he said. "Show us." Not a concession. A test. Isabella didn't flinch. "You'll see the site. You'll hear from the people using what we've built, not just the people financing it." She lifted her father's pen, weighed it, put it back down. "If after that you still want to slice this apart, we'll talk." They filed out suits, polished shoes, the soft chime of phones buzzing inside jackets. They stepped into the bright morning and into the hum of a town holding itself together with grit and caffeine and stubborn affection. The line parted without being told, creating a corridor. Not a red carpet. A dirt path between folding chairs and clipboards and hand-lettered signs. "We work here. We learn here. We stay here." David stood at the front, baseball cap pulled low, sawdust still in the grooves of his knuckles. He didn't reach for a microphone. He didn't have one. He lifted his chin. "This way." They began at the skeleton of the community center. The steel ribs gleamed against a sky too blue for yesterday's kind of trouble. Blueprints had been clipped to plywood thumbtacks, glinting like stars. A hand-painted sign read, "Future Commons," the corners curling gently in the breeze. Structural upgrades. David said voice level. Wind shear bracing, deepened footings. If a funnel comes through again, this building hunkers down and breathes. It doesn't snap. He laid a scarred palm against a column as he spoke, as if introducing an old friend. The board watched. One of the director's Vogel compact restless ran a finger along a weld. "Who did this, my crew?" David said. "And half the high school." A snort meant to be quiet escaped the back row, a sound halfway between skepticism and surprise. "Come on," Isabella said, guiding them with the light pressure of a hand at an elbow. "Let me show you why we call this integrated." In a temporary classroom under a canopy, kids in mismatched chairs hunched over laptops and stray bits of aluminum. Soldering smoke rose in thin curls. Emily stood at the front with her robot, a little beast on treads, with a bucket arm and bright unblinking eyes. "Good morning," she said like a hostess who'd practiced in the mirror. "We built a debris sorter. It recognizes materials, separates them, and sends recyclables down the line." "Who wrote your classifier?" Harrison asked, skeptical curiosity edging his tone. "Me," Emily said, and shrugged like it wasn't the wildest sentence she'd ever said. "Mostly. With help." She pointed to Carlos's son, who flushed at the mention. The robot whirred forward, nudged a heap of mixed junk, and began to sort wood. Here, metal there, plastics in a third bin. It hiccuped on a coffee cup, reconsidered, corrected itself. The room clapped without being told. A board member with pearl earrings leaned toward Isabella. "What's your retention plan?" "These kids will leave as soon as another city offers a bigger lab." "They're building the bigger lab," Isabella said. "Here." They moved on. The quilting circle had colonized a shaded corner, their tables crowded with fabric thread and coffee cups that had been refilled too many times. Patterns lay pinned like constellations. "This is nonsense," Vogel muttered, but not loud enough to be brave. Mrs. Rodriguez lifted a square that looked like a wave caught mid-breath. We use the rhythm of the cooling system, she said, smiling a little at her own audacity as a metronome. It helps our hands keep steady. One of Isabella's quantum engineers, young, intense hair, sticking up like ideas lived in it, leaned down, eyes bright. What if we map these patterns to error-correcting codes? The quilters blinked. He laughed. Not at them with them. I mean, your eyes find mistakes faster than our software catches decoherence faults. You're seeing the noise. We can learn from that. Harrison's jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. He hadn't expected to feel his interest sharpen at a table covered in thread. At Wilson's Market, a whiteboard propped on a crate showed sales lines climbing like a hill a kid would roll down. Wilson slapped the board with a thick hand. 40% up, he said, pride and exhaustion stitched together in his voice. Hired 3 teenagers, paid them fair. They taught me how to set up online ordering. We're an app, for heaven's sake. And these microgreens, another director asked, all spreadsheet, no soil. Groaning back, Wilson said, thumbing toward a jury-rigged rack of lights and trays that glowed like an alien garden. Power from a rooftop array your people spect. He nodded at Isabella, then at David. We feed folks. Folks feed us. Circular. A National Guard officer met them at the corner of a street half open, half obstinate. Your integrated comms kept our bands from stepping on each other, she told Isabella without preamble. We shaved response times by 12 minutes in the last storm cell. That's lives. Isabella's throat moved. Thank you, she said. The words came out rougher than she'd intended. By late morning, the board had been led gently and relentlessly through proof. Not a pitch deck. Not a glossy video. People. Machines built on folding tables. Charts drawn in dry erase and hope. A rhythm, help, learn, build, repeat. Warming the air like a drumbeat you slowly realize has become your heartbeat. They ended where they had to, back at the community center frame, the floor chalked with outlines of rooms not yet real. Lab, commons, kitchen, makerspace. A kid had written hide-and-seek champion inside a closet and drawn a stick figure with triumphant arms. David stood in the chalk where the front doors would be. He didn't climb the sawhorse stage they'd rigged. He didn't need height. He had the intimacy of a voice everyone knew. You've seen the parts, he said. Here's the whole. He gestured the steel, the kids, the quilts, the market, the guard. This isn't charity. It's a contract. You bring resources. We bring roots. You bring hardware. We bring hands. You bring theory. We bring town. He looked at Isabella. Not for permission, for company. She stepped into the chalk beside him. We're ready to codify that, she said, in a way that scales. She held up a slim folder, simple and unadorned. Cedar Grove Framework was printed across the front in clean letters. Principles. Commitments. Not marketing. Harrison's eyes narrowed. Read it. Isabella opened to page 1. Her voice didn't grandstand. It carried. Local hiring at 70% minimum for all builds. Real training, not performative. Open labs scheduled public access alongside secured research. Education braided into operations, not bolted on. Transparent funding, no shadow subsidiaries shielding the work from the people it affects. Shared upside on community-generated IP because innovation happens where curiosity meets need. And that's not always behind a badge. She turned the page. Community liaison seats with voting power on facility boards. Procurement preferences for local suppliers. Small business incubators integrated into campus footprint. A commitment to design with not over. Costs. Vogel said, pouncing like a cat who'd finally seen something twitch. Every one of those lines is a cost. Value, David said before Isabella could answer. Every one of those lines is value that doesn't vanish when a quarter turns ugly. Harrison's gaze slid to the crowd. He saw a teenager teaching an older man how to scan a QR code. He saw an engineer copying a block pattern into a notebook like it was an equation. He saw a market owner holding a crate of greens with a tenderness usually reserved for infants. Time to caucus, he said. They went back inside the bank, turned office. The door shut again, the room the same and not the same. Papers spread, calculations made. Words like precedent and exposure and pilot and PR halo thrown like dice. A few directors wanted a press-friendly compromise with no teeth. One wanted to walk away clean, quick, unarguable. Harrison listened. He looked out the window more than once, and each time he did, he saw not a threat, but a mirror. He saw a company that, for the first time in years, had a chance to be led by something besides fear of the next headline. He turned to Isabella. "You said you'd step down." "If that's what it takes to do this right," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. "I'll take the role that builds the bridges. Give the CEO title to someone who wants walls. I'm done with walls." "And you," Harrison said, looking at David through the glass, as the man spoke to a cluster of teens. "Are you prepared for scrutiny? For this to be ugly, before it's beautiful?" David didn't hear the question. He just kept talking to the kids, demonstrating how to check a line with a level, making sure each one tried it, his hands light on theirs when they needed correcting. Harrison exhaled. "Call the vote," he said. It wasn't unanimous, nothing honest ever is. But it carried. When they came back out, the crowd felt the weather change before the words arrived. You can always feel a front shift, the temperature, the smell, the way shoulders relax without permission. Harrison stepped onto the sawhorse. He didn't clear his throat, didn't preface. "Reyes Quantum will adopt the Cedar Grove framework," he said. "Here. Now. As policy and as pilot." He paused. "Let it land. We will measure it hard. We will broadcast the results. And we will adjust by listening, not dictating." For a half-second, no one moved, like the town was waiting to see if the ground beneath it held. Then noise. Not a cheer, something fuller. The sound of released breath turning into laughter, into clapping, into strangers grabbing each other's shoulders and shaking and saying, "Did you hear? Did you hear? Did you hear?" Isabella didn't smile right away. She closed her eyes. She let the sound wash over her like a kind of absolution. When she opened them, David was there. He hadn't gone anywhere. Of course he hadn't. They brought out a battered folding table for the signing. Someone laid a clean sheet over it like a ritual. The framework pages looked small, sitting there, ordinary paper in a town that had learned how extraordinary paper could be. Harrison signed first. His name cut a decisive diagonal. Directors followed, some with conviction, some with the resigned flourish of people who knew the tide when it was at their knees. Isabella took up her father's pen. The gold felt heavy. History. Heavy. She didn't write Little Dragon. She wrote Isabella Reyes, the hand steady, the ink dark. This was not a wall. David hesitated when the pen was offered to him. "I'm not—" "You are," Isabella said softly. "This doesn't work without the builder." He bent, blocking out the cameras, the crowd, the board, and wrote David Miller in neat, careful letters, like a man fixing a hinge so it won't squeak later. Then Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward. "You left a line," she said, chin up. Isabella smiled and slid the framework to the edge of the table. A dozen more signatures followed: Wilson, the guard officer, the quilter with eyes like an eagle, the teenager with the varsity jacket, the pastor with the generator's manual folded in his back pocket. The header Cedar Grove framework looked different now, less like a title, more like a promise you could build against. A gust tousled the papers. Someone set a level on top to keep them from wandering. Laughter. Applause again. A kid's robot beeped at the exact right-wrong time, and the place grinned like a family photo. By afternoon, the board wasn't standing at the edge anymore. They were in it, listening to a quilter explain phase flips, nodding as a teen detailed sensor drift, tasting microgreens with the skepticism of men who'd never eaten anything that didn't come plated. Local innovation feeding R&D. Harrison murmured more to himself than to anyone else as the young engineer sketched a math he hadn't meant to learn today. Imagine that. "You don't have to," Isabella said, and he didn't argue. As the sun slid lower, a band from 3 towns over set up on the back of a flatbed and began to play something you could two-step to if you wanted, or just sway to if your knees were honest. Children ran in loops no adult could map. The guard officer danced with Wilson's wife. The generator kept on being heroic. David stood at the edge of it, hand on a steel column, the music finding seams inside him and turning tight places loose. Isabella joined him shoulder to shoulder, not quite touching both, looking at what they'd lit. "Ready to build it for real?" he asked. She tilted her head toward the humming frame. "I thought we already were." He smiled. "Tomorrow, we start faster." Tomorrow would be concrete and schedules and 1,000 small arguments about where a window should go and how a lab breathes and who gets the first set of keys. Tomorrow would be the work. Tonight, under strings of borrowed lights and a sky that promised nothing. And somehow everything Cedar Grove celebrated the signing of a document and the start of a life. The framework sat on the table corners, curling as if eager to move. The signatures gleamed, and somewhere in the soft churn of voices someone said, "You can hear the future in here if you listen." They listened, and then they got ready for the morning. By dawn the next day, Cedar Grove hummed like a hive. The signing had been a celebration, but the morning after smelled of work. Concrete dust, wet earth, and coffee too strong to sip without wincing. Pickup trucks crowded the streets. Kids with clipboards ran messages like couriers from one end of town to the other. Hammer blows started before the sun burned the mist away. David Miller was already on site, rolling out blueprints across a folding table spattered with mud and ink smudges. The plans looked different now. Not because the lines had changed, but because every signature from yesterday hung over them like a promise. He smoothed the paper with calloused hands, then leaned over marking notes in pencil. "Morning, boss." Carlos trotted up with 2 coffees' steam curling in the cool air. His eyes were red-rimmed from too little sleep, but his grin was wide. "You see the news?" David grunted. "Haven't had time for TV." Carlos pulled out his phone screen, glowing. They're calling it the Cedar Grove model. Headlines all over: billionaire chooses community over boardroom. Small-town builder signs historic framework. Even CNN ran a clip of Emily's robot sorting debris. They called it a symbol. David blinked, half amused, half uneasy. "It's a box with wheels." "Yeah," Carlos said, "but it's our box with wheels, and people eat that up." Before David could reply, a shadow crossed the table. Isabella stood there, jacket draped over one arm, hair pulled back her heels, traded for work boots that had already learned the mud. The faint exhaustion around her eyes didn't hide the energy buzzing through her. "Good morning," she said, voice calm but carrying. "We've got board members sticking around. Some skeptical, some curious. They'll be watching everything." "Then we'll give them something worth watching," David said, sliding her a copy of the blueprints. They leaned together, shoulder to shoulder, marking sections. His pencil scratched notes in shorthand. Her pen drew neat annotations. From the corner of his eye, David caught how carefully she traced each line, like every wall was a word in a story she wanted told right. By mid-morning, the site had turned into a living fairground of invention. The quilting circle arrived with fabric swatches pinned to plywood, explaining wave patterns to engineers who nodded with genuine interest. High schoolers laid conduit, their laughter ringing against steel beams. Wilson's Market delivered crates of fresh bread and tomatoes to feed the crews, calling it fuel for innovation. Even the skeptical board members found themselves dragged into conversations they hadn't expected. One director, who had once scoffed at community entanglement, was now bent over watching a student explain code for a sensor array. Another found herself listening to Mrs. Rodriguez describe how math and music met in quilting. And at the center of it all, David moved from crew to crew, steady, patient, showing how to level a beam, how to brace a wall, how to measure twice before cutting once. Isabella shadowed parts of his path, not just observing but lifting, holding, kneeling in the dirt, with her pressed slacks creased into streaks of brown. At lunch, someone strung extension cords into the shell of the center. The generator hummed. A projector flickered to life against a plywood wall. Isabella stepped forward, clicker in hand, but her presentation wasn't sleek graphics. It was snapshots, photos of Cedar Grove taken by locals. Emily soldering Carlos's son, holding his MIT letter, the guard officer with radios, Wilson's trays of greens, the quilting circle laughing over thread. This, Isabella said to the room of board members, workers, neighbors, and kids, is return on investment. Not just numbers, though. We have those too. It's something harder to measure, but stronger to keep. When people believe their work matters, when they believe their voices count, innovation grows. Her words carried not because they were polished, but because they were honest. David, standing off to the side, felt the truth of it settle into him. He'd always measured success in walls that stood straight, roofs that kept out rain. But here, with blueprints scattered, children chattering about robots, and board members grudgingly nodding, he realized they were building something thicker than concrete. When the presentation ended, the crowd clapped. Not polite applause, something warmer, deeper, like agreement. As people broke into groups, Emily darted over, tugging Isabella by the sleeve. Miss Reyes, Isabella, she corrected gently. Isabella, Emily said, breathless, I've been thinking about solar tracking systems. What if we... David started to hush her, but Isabella leaned down, eyes bright. Tell me. Emily launched into a rapid description, her hands moving in bursts, her words tripping over each other. Isabella listened, nodding, asking small questions that pulled Emily further deeper. By the time she finished, Isabella was smiling wide. You should see our engineers about this, she said. It's brilliant. Emily beamed, cheeks flushed with pride. She ran off to her friends already shouting ideas. David looked at Isabella, his throat tight. You didn't have to humor her. That wasn't humor, Isabella said quietly. That was respect. The afternoon sun slanted lower. Work slowed. Crews packed up tools. But the board lingered, unwilling to leave just yet. Harrison himself stood near the center frame, hands behind his back, watching the children run through chalk outlines of rooms, laughing as they claimed spaces not yet real. He turned to Isabella. If this fails, it'll fail loud. She nodded. Then we'd better make sure it doesn't. When the last hammer fell quiet, when the generator's hum faded into crickets, David and Isabella stood side by side, overlooking the framework glowing orange in sunset. Today was a start, David said. Today was proof, Isabella replied. She glanced at him, her expression soft. Proof of what's possible. He didn't answer, but his silence was full steady, like a foundation set deep. And though tomorrow would bring new arguments, new headlines, new storms of a different kind tonight, Cedar Grove stood not just on steel and nails, but on something harder to shake. A blueprint for a future that felt for once within reach. The weeks that followed felt like a town waking up to its own heartbeat. Every corner of Cedar Grove pulsed with activity. Trucks rumbled in with supplies, kids pedaled their bikes carrying rolls of tape and boxes of nails. The quilting ladies turned their old community room into an impromptu pattern lab, scrawling equations across fabric scraps as though thread could whisper mathematics. And David Miller, once just a man trying to keep a roof over his daughter's head, found himself called director by board members who couldn't tell a Phillips from a flathead. He never got used to it. On mornings, he rose before sunrise, boots crunching through dew, and walked the framework of the community center like a sentry. Every beam seemed to hum with potential. Every chalk line had become a promise waiting to be poured in concrete. Carlos was always at his side, coffee in hand, half a joke ready. Boss, he said one morning, gesturing at the steel frame, you realize this is going to outlive us, right? That's the point, David muttered, but his throat tightened at the thought. Emily tagged along whenever school released early, her notebook bursting with sketches, robot solar trackers, even a half-finished design for a drone that could map wind shear. She carried herself taller these days, speaking with the confidence of someone who'd been listened to and believed. One evening, David found her sitting on the tailgate of his truck, flipping through her notes with a frown. What's wrong, kiddo? He asked, sliding beside her. Nothing, she said, then sighed. It's just, it feels too good, like maybe they'll take it all away tomorrow. David put an arm around her shoulders. Storms don't last forever, he said, but what we build after that can. Her smile came slowly, but it came. Meanwhile, Isabella moved differently now. Gone was the fortress queen who commanded rooms with ice and precision. She was present, dirt on her slacks hair, windblown from standing too long outside with crews. She'd kneel in the mud with kids sketching circuitry and chalk, and no one called her Miss Reyes anymore. She was simply Isabella. Still, she carried battles invisible to the town. Late at night, in the temporary office, she'd field calls from investors demanding numbers, reassurance, guarantees. She never showed the fatigue, but Richard saw it in her shoulders. You can't fight every front, he cautioned one night. Watch me, she replied, eyes sharp. Then she softened. Besides, I'm not fighting alone anymore. Her gaze had flicked to the window where David stood in the lot below, rolling blueprints beneath a floodlight. The board visited intermittently skeptical eyes, slowly giving way to curiosity. Harrison, once stiff and dismissive, began asking questions with genuine interest. Explain to me again how quilters are solving computational errors, he asked Isabella, shaking his head in disbelief. She smiled. Because they see patterns our machines miss. Innovation doesn't always come from where you expect. By the third week, a rhythm had formed. Mornings began with checklists shouted over clanging metal. Afternoons hummed with kids demonstrating projects, tiny drones, solar models, water filters rigged from soda bottles. Evenings ended with town dinners in the half-built center, laughter echoing against steel beams, the air thick with stew bread and hope. And through it all, David and Isabella kept finding themselves side by side, at first by accident, then by choice. One night after most had gone home, David lingered checking bolts by flashlight. He heard soft footsteps behind him. "You don't stop, do you?" Isabella asked. He shrugged. "Neither do you." They stood in the half-light surrounded by the skeleton of what they were building. She reached out, tracing her fingers along a beam still warm from the day's sun. "When I was little," she said quietly, "my father told me walls kept us safe. But looking at this," she paused, eyes shining faintly. "This feels different. Not a wall. A bridge." David's voice was rough. "Then let's build it strong enough to last." Their silence wasn't empty. It was full of memory of loss of something beginning neither wanted to name yet. The next morning, headlines shifted again. Cedar Grove Framework attracts national interest. Tech meets tradition, the future of community development. Reporters camped outside, cameras angled for glimpses of progress. But inside the town, life went on hammers, laughter, chalk dust, bread baking. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon some evenings, but instead of fear, Cedar Grove now treated them as reminders. Proof that storms come, storms pass, and what you build after matters most. And as David watched Emily race through the framework with her friends and saw Isabella standing nearby with a clipboard tucked under her arm and a smile she didn't hide anymore, he realized something startling. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. And the foundation under his boots wasn't just steel and concrete. It was trust. It was hope. It was love. Though he hadn't yet dared to say the word aloud. The night before the board's final evaluation, Cedar Grove felt charged like the air before a storm. Except this storm wasn't weather. It was judgment numbers and the cold eye of investors. The half-built community center glowed under strings of lights powered by generators. Neighbors gathered with clipboards, food trays, and nervous chatter. Children rehearsed demonstrations of robots and solar trackers. Quilters pinned new patterns to display boards. Wilson hauled in baskets of greens, brushing off his apron as if preparing for battle. David Miller moved through it all like a steady current, checking bolts, adjusting chairs, listening to questions. Every step carried the weight of tomorrow. He felt it pressing in his chest, heavier even than the storm debris he'd once lifted off strangers. Emily tugged at his sleeve. "Dad," she whispered, "what if they don't see it? What if they don't care?" He crouched down, meeting her wide, uncertain eyes. "Then we'll keep building anyway," he said. His voice was low, steady. "Because what we've started here is bigger than their approval. It's ours." She nodded, but the worry didn't leave her face. Across the hall, Isabella Reyes stood at the center of a circle of townsfolk. She wore no suit tonight, just a simple blouse and rolled sleeves, her hair tied back. She looked less like the invisible empress the magazines loved to call her, and more like a woman who belonged to this place. Still, David saw the flicker in her eyes. Nerves, doubt. She excused herself from the circle and crossed to him. "They're sharpening their knives," she murmured. "Tomorrow they'll come looking for weaknesses." "Then we'll show them strength," David replied. But she shook her head. "It isn't just about showing them. It's about believing it ourselves." Her voice was softer now, almost vulnerable. "I've built my life on walls, contracts, subsidiaries, fortresses. Tomorrow, I'm asking them to trust something I've never trusted myself." David studied her, his expression unreadable, then finally spoke. "You trusted me in that storm." Her breath caught. The memory hung between them, splintered beams, roaring wind, the press of his body shielding hers. "I did," she admitted, her voice breaking just enough. "And I still do." The words left them standing too close. Silence stretching until the noise of the hall swept back around them. Later that night, when the town had gone quiet and the last lights flickered off, David sat in his truck with a folded letter in his lap. his resignation. He had written it at dawn, a clean cut meant to protect Isabella and the project if things went bad. If they need someone to blame, let it be me, he'd written. The words burned in his hand, but when he looked through the windshield at the framework glowing faintly under the moon, at Emily's chalk sketches still bright on the slab, at the quilting squares pinned in the windows, like flags he felt torn in two. He closed his eyes. Sarah's face came unbidden, his late wife smiling in the hospital light the day Emily was born. She had always told him he was meant to build more than houses. He swallowed hard, the memory like a voice urging him to stay to fight. A knock on the truck window startled him. Isabella stood there, hair loose now, no makeup, looking less like a billionaire than she ever had. He rolled the window down. "You should be resting. So should you." She leaned closer. "I know what you're planning, David. Don't you dare try to fall on your sword for me." His chest tightened. "If it keeps this alive, it kills what we've built," she snapped, then softer. "Because this only works if we're in it together." Her hand pressed briefly to his, the touch electric in the quiet night. "Stay," she whispered. "Please." For a long moment, he couldn't answer. Then he nodded, the letter still burning in his lap. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held equal parts fear and faith. "Tomorrow," she said, "we show them everything." And in the silence that followed, Cedar Grove seemed to breathe with them, like a town standing at the edge of something larger than itself, ready to leap. The morning broke bright and clear, the kind of Oklahoma sky that seemed too wide to belong to one town. By 8 o'clock, Cedar Grove was already alive. Children carried their robots into the half-built community center. Teachers pinned lesson plans to display boards, and quilters laid out fabric patterns like treasures. Wilson set crates of vegetables near the entrance, his apron clean for once, while Carlos and his crew adjusted beams so everything looked as solid as it felt. David Miller stood by the doors, jaw tight, palms rough against his jeans. In his pocket, the folded resignation letter still pressed against his thigh, like a weight he hadn't discarded. He thought of pulling it out, of slipping it into Isabella's hand before the board arrived, but then Emily appeared at his side, holding her robot close like it was a heartbeat. "Dad," she said softly, "are you scared?" David's throat worked. He forced a smile. "Yeah," he admitted. "But being scared doesn't mean we stop." Her small hand slid into his. "Then let's not stop." The board arrived in black SUVs, stepping out in pressed suits that gleamed too sharp against Cedar Grove's dust. Cameras followed, reporters jostling for sound bites. Harrison led the way, his expression clipped, every movement rehearsed. Isabella met them at the entrance. No fortress makeup, no designer armor, just boots, rolled sleeves, and eyes that burned with steady fire. "Welcome," she said. "This is Cedar Grove." Inside, the presentation wasn't slides or charts. It was life. Kids demonstrated robots sorting debris with nervous pride. Quilters explained how their patterns revealed hidden codes. Wilson waved sales reports smudged with flour. The guard officer showed shortened response times thanks to integrated comms. Everywhere the board looked, the town was there, not just as workers, but as innovators, partners, co-builders. "This is chaos," Vogel muttered under his breath. "No," Harrison said quietly, though he didn't mean to say it out loud. "This is something else." At the front, David and Isabella stood together. The Cedar Grove framework lay open on a battered table, signatures already sprawling across its pages. David spoke first, his voice carrying rough honesty. "This isn't perfect. It's messy. It's loud. But it's real. You can walk away and build another sterile facility somewhere else. Or you can stay and help us prove that progress and people don't have to be enemies." He stepped back. Isabella's turn. "I told you yesterday," she said, her voice steady. "I'd step down if it meant saving this. But today I'm telling you I won't. Because this isn't mine anymore. It's theirs." She gestured to the crowd. "This belongs to Cedar Grove, and if that scares you, then maybe it should, because this is the future." A hush fell. Reporters scribbled, cameras clicked. Then Emily, unable to contain herself, wheeled her robot forward. Its bucket arm clattered as it sorted scraps into neat piles. "If you walk away," she said boldly, "you're walking away from us." Gasps rippled. Harrison stared at the girl, at the robot, at the hope stitched into her trembling voice. Something inside him shifted, quiet but undeniable. The vote was called. It wasn't unanimous, but it carried. Rhea's quantum technologies would adopt the Cedar Grove framework not as a compromise, but as a model. Applause erupted, cheering laughter, tears, people hugged, shouted, clapped each other on the back. Cameras captured it all, but what mattered wasn't the headlines, it was the sound of a town believing in itself. David felt Emily throw her arms around his waist, her laughter muffled against his shirt. Across the room, Isabella caught his eye, her smile breaking through exhaustion like dawn through storm clouds. Later, as the sun lowered and the town spilled into the streets. In celebration, Isabella found David standing at the edge of the framework, the resignation letter torn in half at his feet. "You stayed," she said softly. "I stayed," he replied. Their hands found each other calloused and manicured, rough and careful and held. Around them, Cedar Grove sang with life music, laughter, the clang of tools, even in celebration. Above them, the framework reached higher into the sky, steel bones catching golden light. It wasn't finished, not yet, but it would be, together. Your thoughts will help us create meaningful stories, and if you want to hear more powerful healing stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the bell icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And most importantly, share this video with people who need a little hope today. Thank you so much for your time. We hear you, we listen to you, and we are honored to tell these stories for you.